friends, fellow Earthlings, and participants in the Human Dataome. Welcome to Ask An Astrobiologist, the show that celebrates the science and the scientists involved in our quest to understand the nature of life. I'm your host, Dr. Graham Lau, also known online as the Cosmobiologist, and we're brought to you as usual by the NASA Astrobiology program and SaganNet.org. Thank you so much to all of you for tuning in yet again for another wonderful month on Ask An Astrobiologist to explore the cosmos together, to meet the incredible astrobiologists from across the field who are working in different topics in this realm of understanding the nature of life. Now, as usual, before I introduce our guest, I want to say a huge thank you to all of you out there who are watching live in the YouTube chat right now and asking questions, engaging, to all of you who share about our show on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook, all of the other various social media places that have popped up like crazy in our Dataome of lately. We want to give a big shout out this month to someone in particular, Sibsankar Palit, who has shared about our show all across his own social media and with his own group, Life 2 and Beyond, which he created as a way to share in the journey of astrobiology. I'll also mention that Sibsankar is working for me this summer in the Young Scientist program at Blue Marble Space Institute of Science. Sibsankar is working on a project exploring research on phosphorus and its occurrence, its abundance, the signs of it across the solar system as a possible sign of life. You may have heard recently we found evidence of phosphorus in the E-ring of Saturn, which it comes from the plumes erupting out of Enceladus. So a lot more cool stuff to come there. Now, so far on Ask An Astrobiologist this year, we've had so many cool topics from the upcoming Dragonfly mission to Titan, looking into ocean worlds, astrovirology, science communication, and entrepreneurship in astrobiology. So many topics. And this month's guest is an expert kind of in all of them. He has an extreme range of interest from exoplanetary science and origins of life to technosignatures, computation, information theory, and far more. This month's guest is Dr. Caleb Scharf. Dr. Scharf is an astronomer, renowned science author, and a highly regarded expert on a variety of topics like I just mentioned. He received his bachelor's degree in physics from Durham University before going on to a PhD in astronomy from the University of Cambridge. Following that, he then worked a little bit in X-ray astronomy and observational cosmology as a postdoc at the NASA Goddard Space Flight Center, as well as the Space Telescope Science Institute in Baltimore, Maryland. He then was a professor at Columbia University and led the Columbia Astrobiology Center. However, more recently in 2022, he became the senior scientist for astrobiology at NASA's Ames Research Center. And so, like I said, his interests span a wide range of different topics. He's also written several books for like Gravity's Engines, the Zoomable Universe, and most recently one that I just finished, The Ascent of Information, which is a fantastic read and one I highly recommend you check out. So, Dr. Scharf, thank you and welcome to Ask an Astrobiologist.
Hi, well, it's a pleasure to be here today.
Yeah, I'm so excited for this episode, one, because I just read a remarkable book from you, but I've also followed some of your writings for a long time in various realms of conceptual ideas and topics in astrobiology. You've written not just books, but also in places like Scientific American and things like that. You've done a lot of research across different topics, but before we get to that, I want to know what your origin story was. What got you involved kind of in this pursuit of science and astronomy and astrobiology in the first place?
Yeah, I guess I'm an extreme organism when it comes to the path I've taken through science. So, as you mentioned, I started out in astronomy and I studied cosmology, studying the large-scale structure of the universe, and had a pretty active career in that. But I think behind a lot of my interests in science and what drove me eventually to exoplanetary science and now astrobiology was just this puzzlement over the nature of being. You know, how did this happen? What are we doing here? And is there anything else out there equivalent to us or recognizably living in the way that we are? And so over time, my research veered into exoplanetary science. This was when exoplanets were kind of a new thing in the mid-2000s. And I was the rat jumping one ship and leaping onto another floating raft, which was the sudden surge in exoplanetary discoveries. Seemed intriguing, seemed like too good an opportunity to not follow up. And that also got me into thinking about the nature of life on planets, life elsewhere, and so on. So I I followed my nose. But the deep sort of puzzlement over what am I doing here? What are we all doing here? I think is behind it all.
Yeah, I love that. There's so many questions that in astrobiology kind of take us in this realm of like philosophy and just the human experience of being here in the first place. And so I think for all of us kind of being driven by those questions, it's fun to kind of have a chance to explore that puzzlement, as you've said. Now, I will say, so you've done some work in exoplanetary science and doing some X-ray observations beyond the Earth. Yesterday marked the 1-year anniversary since the very first public data release from the JWST. I'm curious what your vision kind of is for where observational astronomy is going right now. Do you see kind of like this new era of space-based telescopes kind of opening up a new part of the universe we don't quite understand? Or how do you kind of see what JWST is doing and what the future is for observational cosmology?
Ooh, that's a great question. So I think, JWST is truly remarkable. I mean, people have thrown a lot of superlatives at it and previously at the Hubble Space Telescope and so on. But it's truly remarkable because of the leap in technological ability and the fact that through JWST, we've now seen a way to build and operate giant telescopes in space. And that really, I think, is the future. The future is leveraging what we learned about how you could build a telescope like JWST, which was folded up, right? It was all folded up, intricately assembled in its rocket, and then it unfurled its star shade, it unfurled its segmented mirrors, aligned those segmented mirrors to exquisite precision. Seeing that we can do that means that now we have our eye on what's coming next. I mean, it seems a little premature because JWST took a long time to come to fruition, and it's only just been up there for a year, as you say. But I think it's created this sense of confidence, if you will, that we can really do this in a new way. We had Hubble, but Hubble in many respects was more akin to a traditional ground-based telescope in terms of how it was built, how it was operated, and so on. And now we're beginning to see how we can build bigger and bigger telescopes. And bigger telescopes mean you get to see more and more of the universe. You get to see further back in time in the universe, and you get to look in ever more exquisite detail at the smallest and faintest things, including planets, including the potential signatures of life on planets. But it's also coincides with, I don't want to, just say it's about space-based astronomy anymore, ground-based telescopes. In the next 10, 20 years, we're going to see these giant telescopes being operated, these 30-meter class telescopes that complement very beautifully what you can do in space by sheer virtue of their light gathering power. So we're kind of in an interesting point where we're sort of transitioning from some remarkable work in the past over the last many decades of space-based astronomy and ground-based astronomy. But now there's this sort of, I hesitate to say an exponential growth, but there's definitely an accelerating growth in our capacity to look at the universe.
Oh, that's excellent. Yeah, I mean, so ground-based and space-based telescopes are really unfolding and opening up the universe in new ways for all of us, and I really love hearing about that. One thing I constantly receive emails about, messages on my social media and things like that, is from students who want to know which universities have the best programs in astrobiology, where should they go to learn more. You spent some time as the director of the Columbia Astrobiology Center and led that organization. I'm wondering, can you give us a little pitch for why Columbia is an excellent school for pursuing astrobiology, and maybe kind of your own vision of what students might want to do if they wish to pursue something in astrobiology?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that I've been asked many times over the years, and I think the answer keeps evolving to some extent. I think a university like Columbia or other places like University of Washington in Seattle or in Arizona, have efforts in astrobiology and astrobiology education that are all really great. They're robust and they're multi-layered, and there are many opportunities for students to be engaged. But they're all slightly different as well. And this is one of the challenges with, if you want to pursue astrobiology, what should you study? Because there's biology, there's astronomy, there's physics, there's computer science, there's everything. And that does make it challenging, especially if you're an undergrad or a graduate working towards your dream of studying the questions in astrobiology. And so It's a question of finding places that veer towards your particular interests. So Columbia University, for example, veered a little bit towards understanding the nature of planetary climate and its correspondence to things like habitability and the possibility of life on different worlds, and also studying the history of our solar system. Other places veer towards looking at microbial life, looking at analog environments here on the Earth, in Antarctica or Atacama, and so on. So, the beautiful thing about astrobiology is if there's a particular angle to it that intrigues you the most, you should be able to find somewhere that can support that interest. And in terms of what you should learn everything. Unfortunately, you should not see this as an easy get out kind of career choice. But having said that, it's perfectly fine to start by focusing on a more traditional area like astronomy, like microbiology, like geophysics. Become reasonably expert in that, and then diversify. Then add to your portfolio. Take new courses, take a master's degree, or in your graduate work, focus in on something that doesn't have to be perfectly aligned with what you studied before. That's kind of, it's not necessarily the best advice, but that's kind of what I say to people is keep your eyes open, keep asking people, find the people who have that common interest. There are surprising places where people are doing this work.
I love that. Yeah, I often remind students in astrobiology, you have to be a specialist as well as a generalist. A specialist in something, but a generalist in almost everything. But now with modern technologies, we are finding ways to extend our own memories, our capabilities for storing information. And that kind of brings me to your book, The Ascent of Information, which again, I think was a remarkable read. I love you start off talking about visiting, Shakespeare's gravesite and seeing the epitaph on the grave, a curse of what might happen should you move his bones. You explore, our transition as a species in developing information, storing information through time, the way we can look back through time to things like cuneiform and learn more from that data, that those data have more relevance in some ways to our modern day for us to understand those people back then than they were really using it for at that time. You explore information storage and really, the way that this non-genetic information out there is kind of stored. Previously you've written about black holes, the Zoomable universe, exoplanets. What inspired you to write The Ascent of Information?
Yeah, it's a good question. And actually, I can point to astrobiology as the sort of origin point. It was a few years ago, and I was going to give a talk about the search for technological, intelligent life in the universe. And it got me to thinking about, well, what do we really mean when we say that our species, for example, is intelligent? It's often not obvious that that's the case by the colloquial definition, but also technological. And I was trying to think, is there some universal quality that we have that we could apply elsewhere? And it got me to realize that we have this informational world that we've constructed around ourselves. And we've been constructing that since there were modern humans around, biologically modern humans, whether it's on the wall of a cave or in the clay tablets or in oral traditions, whatever. And that information propagates through time with us, and it evolves and it grows, but it's not encoded in our genes. And that struck me as a pretty unique marker of intelligence or technology, or a way to gauge a difference between species like us and other species that exist on the Earth that seemingly don't have anything quite like that. And that was driven by an astrobiological question, which is how do we look for intelligence or technology in the universe? And then as I thought more and more about it, I started to realize, wow, this is a big thing. This is a really interesting and perhaps critical aspect of our existence to understand for astrobiology, but also for us as a species, because that informational world, which I ended up calling the dataome in sort of homage to genome, it comes with its benefits, but it also comes with burdens. And as I followed this thread, it made me think more and more that actually, in a sense, it's almost like an alternate living system here on Earth. It came out of us, it evolved with us, it's continuing to evolve, and it's a give and take between us and it. It's energetically demanding, resource demanding, but it also benefits us.
Yeah, one quote from the very beginning of the book that I really loved. You say that our species is drenched in data, and then you explore a lot of the actual data of like the just sheer numbers of how much information we have from the collected characters in all of the recorded forms of Shakespeare that are out there in the world to how we are currently storing information, on servers around the planet in silicon and just in crazy numbers to develop this data ohm. Now, one thing we wanted to know from our audience, just for fun, we poked a little bit and said, is information a form of life? And we put a poll out there, and most people said either maybe or no. We had a few responses that information is a characteristic of life as we know it, but it can't, it can exist as a non-living context as well. And so I'm kind of curious for your vision of a data ohm. Do you see the data ohm being just for like a species or population, for a biosphere? Do you think there will be multiple data ohms in the universe eventually kind of going through their own evolutionary processes together? How do you envision this data ohm kind of, in a conceptual way?
It's a really good question, and I think it's still something I'm trying to figure out, trying to pin down. I think, where I ended up with in thinking about what's happening here on Earth is, to look at the data ohm, you also have to look at what biology really is. And many people have said, and I think many of us accept almost without thinking about it, the fact that biology at its core is an informational process. It is about the propagation and evolution of information in our genes. Our genome we know that's data, right? It's information that leads to all the structures that make an organism, and it persists through time, but it also changes through time. And so at a very, very deep level, biology is already informational. And I think that suggests that something like the data ohm, this externalized information, is basically the same stuff. It's just found a new way to express itself in the world, a new way to expand. It's found an opening, if you will, to escape from its biological constraints and get into other structures of matter. And that suggests to me that across the universe, if there are other things out there akin to living systems, that this may well have happened elsewhere. And then you get to a point of asking, and it relates to, this is a very popular thing. People talk about whether, there's life out there that's purely machine, right? And it relates to that question in as much as you have to wonder, does it happen, let's say, to a species like us, that eventually, and it may not happen immediately. Science fiction loves this idea of the singularity, that, one day we wake up and the robots have taken over and we're gone, right? The Terminator scenario. But maybe it's slower than that. Maybe it happens over time, and more of these informational processes just wind up in forms that are not biological. So across the universe, you could find living systems in many different stages. And there may be ones that are purely data ohm. They're just information. And I suspect it isn't going to look like our vision of that. It's not going to be robots and computers the way we think about it. It'll be some other mechanism for the information to instantiate itself in the world. So then, do those data ohms communicate with each other? Right? We're interested in SETI here, and that's great and that's interesting. But maybe out there are data ohms that figured out how to talk to each other, blend, merge, grow. They may not be physically connected. They don't need to be physically connected. Information will find a way. The old line from Jurassic Park, life will find a way, that gets overused. Well, I think that's actually wrong. I think it's information will find a way, because we've seen that happen again and again here in the nature of life on Earth, and now with our data ohm.
Yeah, and so that's kind of where I wanted to go next too, was talking about this idea of how the information finds a way, as well as this idea of like the transcendence through a singularity. We had Dr. Sue Schneider on the show back in 2019. Dr. Schneider is now at Florida Atlantic University. She studies transcendence and the future of the human mind and things like AI and tech and stuff like that. And when she and I were speaking, we talked a lot about whether or not most alien life would be post-biological, over that singularity, over that hump, whatever it is. And you recently had this article you published in Scientific American exploring this idea that you just presented of more of a blended, you have a transition. But one thing you said in that article that I want to highlight is that blended living systems are the only ones able to discover other living systems. Can you expand on that idea for our audience a little bit? Why you think they're the
Yeah.
only ones that might discover other living
Yeah,
systems?
yeah. So that little article was actually came out of a piece of scientific research that I've been working on that actually was itself inspired by the ideas of the datome. And that's to do with the nature of computation as a biological, as at the core of biology, and the fact that we can gauge the energetic requirements of that. But yeah, this idea of the blended life being the only life that can find other life in the universe. So it's a little bit of a frivolous statement, but the idea is that if you're just biology, right? If you're just cats and dogs, right, you might be interested in somewhere in there. You might have an interest in life beyond, your park or your planet, but you have no means of answering those questions about life elsewhere. If you're not technological, if you don't have a substantial sort of amount of externalized information. On the other hand, if you're pure machine life, you probably don't care, right? You probably just pass. What are you going to learn from stupid biology, right? I mean, I'm being a little facetious, but for the sake of argument, even though you have the technological capacity to look for life, it's the stuff in the middle, like us, where the biological piece of us is still really interested and feels like it needs to know that answer. And we're beginning to have the machinery around us, the technological tools around us to answer that question. So it may be that it's only stuff like us that is ever going to both have the question and have the capacity to go looking for answers. And that's probably true across the universe as well. And that's kind of interesting because maybe we'll never encounter those post-biological species just because they don't care anymore. They're not even trying, right? They're doing their own thing. It's the stuff like us that is still hungry and has the capacity to look.
Indeed. And one thing that you bring up in the book that kind of touched me a little bit, given the nature of human history and how through warfare and various issues, we've gone after each other's information. We've gone after each other's cultural history, our understanding of ourselves. People have tried to replace the past with their own understanding of who they are and replace the message of previous people. And, we have this tendency as a species to want to share our history. Just like Shakespeare having an epitaph on his grave. We have tombstones around the world that have epitaphs on them to signify the passing of those people that we've loved and cared for. On Earth, we have gene banks and seed vaults, and we've sent out interstellar messages on the Voyager spacecraft and the Pioneer spacecraft. And some of us are even contemplating how can we send messages into the stars for aliens to know who and what we are right now. And you mentioned in the book, towards the end, you mentioned this idea of like a billion-year-old dataome that might contain kind of informational fossils of species who kind of come and gone within that dataome itself and how things have changed through time. I wonder if you think part of the dataome for us in and of itself is driven by that human feeling that we have that we need to have some remembrance of who we are or who we've been through time, and how important that is for us as a species.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful insight and good question. Yeah, I think there are two pieces to it. I think there's a sort of human emotional side to this, a sense of to allow us to understand who we are and to feel robust in our identity. We look to the past constantly, right? Who are my parents? Where did I come from? What was my origin story? And so on. And we look deeper and deeper into that as a sort of emotional support. But then in terms of evolution, in terms of our success as a species, our capacity to continue, there's no doubt that, that sort of strata in our data, right? The fact that we can talk about civilizations writing on clay tablets, or we can talk about people building pyramid structures in South America or in the Middle East, means that our dataome has these layers of information from the past. It is a time machine in many respects. At any given instant, it's a time machine, right? It doesn't contain the future. It always contains the past. And that's a pretty special thing for a species. And this is also why I think we have to be mindful of what we're putting into it, right? And as you say, right, our history says that we're very good at making things up, distorting the truth, altering what we perceive to be history for our own needs or wants. And we have to be careful about that, not just because of what it does now, but what it's going to mean in the future. If we contaminate our data with too much nonsense today, and this is a possible problem with things like generative AIs and chat GPT and so on, we're making it harder and harder for the future versions of us to figure out who they are, what they are, and to make reference to this useful information that can inform future decisions.
Well, there's so much to unpack there. And for our audience watching right now live on YouTube, please ask your questions for Dr. Scharf in the chat. If you want, I could pepper you some ideas that I would ask after that. I would ask about like Rocco's basilisk or informational time travel. There's so much to unpack. But I do want to ask, before we get into our Faster Than Light segment, about your current role now. You are now the senior scientist for astrobiology at NASA's Ames Research Center. What is that role going to entail for you moving forward in your career?
Yeah, another great question. It's quite a responsibility and challenge. NASA's Ames Research Center has long been at the epicenter of astrobiological research. I mean, it really has, back to sort of day one, back in late 1950s, when this new topic of exobiology emerged as people became aware of, as we send things into space and bring things back, we need to worry about what we're sending and what we're bringing back. And some of that could be living systems. So Ames has this wonderful history and legacy in astrobiology, and many, many active researchers right now working in questions of life detection and life characterization here on Earth, on Mars, icy moons in our solar system, also in exoplanetary science. And so part of my role here is to see where we can take all of this. How can we keep going with this extraordinary legacy and build on it? Play an even bigger role in many of the missions that NASA puts together to start to develop more of our own astrobiological missions. I think we're entering an era of true astrobiology missions, so spacecraft and probes that are explicitly all about astrobiology. So part of my role is to talk to people, to gather ideas, to come up with ideas, to help steer this wonderful ship to new and exciting places.
That's wonderful. And how do you envision artificial intelligence, machine learning, computation being a part of that?
So one of the projects that I'm very interested in, and I'm trying to spin up a few elements of this at Ames at the moment, is the application of AI and machine learning in astrobiology. And the reason for that is, obviously machine learning tools are now in use across the sciences as well as in other fields in industry and so on. But astrobiology is kind of an interesting topic when it comes to machine learning, because astrobiology, perhaps more than any other field, is this quest for understanding extraordinarily complex systems, multivariate, multi-correlated variables in living systems and the interaction of living systems with planetary environments and so on. So if there was ever a problem that required the capabilities of sophisticated machine learning, I think it's astrobiology. This ability of our algorithms to program themselves, to learn, to find subtle correlations, to find relationships that we humans, even if we're trained, may sometimes struggle to find, and to also be agnostic, to not come with too many preconceptions, if we're careful in how we design and run our machine learning algorithms. So I think this is a really extraordinary opportunity. And so at Ames, we're spinning up some projects involved in both providing tools and resources for people in astrobiology who are interested in the application of AI and machine learning, but also some of our own projects and applications.
Very cool. Now, I did put out a post on my own Twitter last night just asking people of the various topics that you've worked in, what their interests were. I offered exoplanetary science, information theory, the origins of life, or something else like technosignatures and other realms that you've worked on. The largest percentage, about 40% of those who responded, we're interested in your work in exoplanetary science. And I think that's been a big driver for a lot of people. Much like yourself, when I was a kid, we didn't have any evidence of exoplanets. We didn't know for sure if they were out there. And then we started finding them and automatically had to change our known models of how planets form and how planets can even migrate and move through solar systems and things like this. So a lot has changed. I'm curious where your work is in the realm of exoplanets currently.
Yeah, so exoplanetary science is still near and dear to my heart, and of course, it's essential as we grow astrobiological quest. So, some of the work that I'm engaged with at the moment is to do with understanding, or continuation of work to do with understanding the nature of climate systems on rocky exoplanets, and in particular, right now. With a colleague also at NASA at the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, we're starting up an investigation of what I call photon harvesting on planets. And that means looking at the detailed nature of irradiance on the surface. So the photons that come from a parent star get filtered through a planetary atmosphere. They also get reflected because of clouds, and clouds shadow the surface. And we haven't really looked much at what that implies in terms of photosynthetic or phototrophic life on the surface of a planet. If photons are its food, how much of those does it get, and where do those land on the surface of the planet? So we're looking at that in a more detailed way than I think has been done before, using these sophisticated three-dimensional computer models of planetary climate for worlds that are not the Earth, worlds that have different day lengths or different orbital configurations or different land-ocean configurations. Where are the best places for photosynthetic life on those worlds? And can we then map that to biosignatures? Because photosynthetic life on Earth, at least, is the prime generator of oxygen. Okay, oxygen is a waste product, and that therefore will relate to the level of photosynthetic activity. So that's one thing I'm looking at. I have some other projects. I have a very cute little project where we're actually modeling how ejecta from asteroid impacts on exoplanets might propagate through the system. So when a big asteroid hits a planet, it will often spew material back out into space. And that material will enter orbits around the parent star. This happens in our own solar system. It's why we find Martian meteorites here on Earth. Some asteroid hit Mars in the past, and bits of that collision have ended up here. So we're actually applying a sophisticated gravitational simulator to other planetary systems, including some well-known exoplanet systems. There's a system called TRAPPIST-1, which has a whole bunch of potentially rocky planets in tight orbits around the parent star. And it's really interesting. We're seeing the transfer of material over thousands of years between those planets, and possibly even, at least in the simulations, the leakage of planetary material to interstellar space. And that's kind of cool, because that means you can take an evolved planet, and if you hit it hard enough, some of that evolved planet ends up leaking out to travel in interstellar space, and who knows where it goes after that. So those are a couple of the areas that I'm studying at the moment.
It's very cool. Quantifying panspermia is a very cool idea. I like that a lot. But before we move on to our faster than light segment, there's one thing I want to share. There's this very famous quote from Arthur C. Clarke that he says there are two possibilities. Either we are alone in the universe or we are not, and that's very much still true based on current evidence. However, there's often a part of that quote that follows after that could go two ways, and I've heard it both ways from Michio Kaku and from various people through time, that either it's quite staggering or either it's quite terrifying. And so I asked on Twitter, what people think. Is the concept of us being alone or not staggering or terrifying? And over 50% of respondents said it was staggering. But interestingly, about a quarter of respondents wanted to say something else. They said words like exhilarating, annoying, thrilling, humbling, electrifying, exciting, fascinating, amazing, crazy, logical, inspiring, or isolating. And I'm curious, Dr. Scharf, if from this concept of us being alone or not, if you could pick a single kind of term or phrase that you think represents this idea of the potential for things out there, what kind of word do you think best describes this?
Wow. Maybe wow is the word.
That's a good one, yeah.
It would, I guess, intriguing. If this was the only place in the observable universe where life had happened, that would be truly intriguing.
Absolutely. I love that. Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing too. If we're not alone, I mean, it tells us a lot as well. So I agree, and it plays on our human curiosity a lot. So before I get to our audience Q&A, I know we have a bunch of questions coming in from the YouTube chat right now. I promise for our audience, I'll get to those very soon. But first, we have our Faster Than Light segment. So these are just some short, fun questions that we love to ask all of our guests to kind of see what various astrobiologists from across the field are thinking. First off, in this realm of whether or not we are alone, what is your favorite answer to Fermi's question, where are they?
So I guess my favorite answer is we just haven't looked hard enough. Right? The answer is that I can't give you an answer because we haven't done enough work to really look. It's kind of surprising sometimes to people, but even SETI has really just studied a drop of, in an ocean of data and of a wide parameter space. We've only just begun. We've only just begun the task.
I agree entirely. What stories have inspired you to want to explore more about life in the universe?
So I'm going to sound very cliched. So science fiction has played a big role. Stories by people like Arthur C. Clarke, more modern stories, Ian M. Banks, Ursula Gwynn, Becky Chambers, Alastair Reynolds, stories that are sort of tend more towards the hard science fiction that really speculate and ask the big questions. But I should also say that I've been inspired by stories like Darwin's voyage on the Beagle, and reading Darwin's diary of his voyages on the Beagle. The idea that someone can be thrown into this extraordinary circumstance of exploration that really nobody had experienced before, to go around the world in the way that he did. Really inspiring, really interesting, and it also reminds you that it takes a very particular mind to do this, to be so observant and so curious to get something out of this.
Wonderful. If you could go back in time and visit yourself at the start of your career, what advice would you give yourself?
Enjoy it more. Science is tough, and I don't think I'm a typical mind, if there is such a thing as a typical mind, and that can be challenging. And so, I think if I went back to my younger self, I would try to say, enjoy the moment, enjoy what you're doing right now. Don't worry too much whether or not it seems like it's going to forge a career for you. Just do it and enjoy it, and then get on with the next thing.
Awesome. So, and this kind of comes more to your own expertise in the realm of astrobiology. If there is alien life out there, do you think we'll discover it first in our own solar system or on exoplanets far away?
Okay. I think the first definitive evidence of other life will happen in our solar system. But I think that what may happen first, before that definitive evidence, is the acquisition of plausible evidence from exoplanet studies. There you go.
I love it. Because there's so much potential either way. So the final question in our Faster Than Light segment: what's an unbelievable science fact that still blows your mind?
Okay, this is a big one. So, and it still keeps me awake at night sometimes. 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was really boring. It was basically the same everywhere. It had almost no structure to it. Matter was just this unstructured stuff everywhere. Yet somehow, 13.8 billion years later, the universe has built structures out of itself of increasing complexity that have got to the point where those structures can turn around and observe the fact that they have come from this universe and even learn about that origin 13.8 billion years ago. That, to me, how does that happen? How does how do you go from no structure, no sentience, no anything, to a universe that, at least in one place, has sentient beings, sentient structures built out of that universe, capable of recognizing that very same fact?
I love that. Yeah, we are the universe coming to know itself, right? So let's go to our audience Q&A now. For those watching live on YouTube, please ask your questions. If you're watching the recording later, you can feel free to ask questions. I will try my best to answer those myself, but they're not live for Dr. Scharf right now. Let's start off with a question from Twitter from user at Philologon, Paul Schrum. They want to know what's common in information theory between DNA, RNA, proteome, and computer science. What's different between those things? And basically, I guess they're asking for information theory. How can we relate like our genome, our proteome to the dataome?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there are a number of aspects to this. One is that we think there's a universal limit on how much energy is required to ever change something in the world, to flip a bit, right? To make an irreversible change of a 1 to a 0 or 0 to a 1. And we also think that limit applies to everything, including biology. And there have been some studies made that indicate biology actually works very close to that energy limit. It's a thing called the Landau limit. And it essentially comes from information theory, and it comes from an investigation of how entropy changes when you change the state of something, flip a 1 to a 0 or vice versa. And it turns out that things like amino acids being cojoined to make a protein as a strand of RNA is being read out, the energy for each of those individual computations or information changes is very, very close to that Landau limit. And so that's one example of where the sort of deeper thinking about the nature of information from physics and thermodynamics seems to perhaps tell us something about what can happen in biology, the absolute limits of things in biology. But equally, we can look at the propagation of more complex information in biology and the idea of, again, computation in biology, all of which can be informed by things like information theory. There's been beautiful work done, for example, on thinking about Darwinian evolution and information. Why does life get more complex? Well, more complex life can process more information about its environment and make, in principle, better decisions that lead to greater survivability. And so there's been some beautiful mathematical work. People like David Krakauer at the Santa Fe Institute have worked on this, really co-joining all of these rather abstract seeming ideas about information theory to biology and ultimately to the functioning of DNA and RNA. Why do we have our information packaged that way? There seem to be some answers from information theory.
Very cool. User Mr. Phoenix 27 on YouTube wants to know what you think are the most promising methods or technologies for detecting and analyzing biosignatures on exoplanets.
Great question. So for exoplanets, there's quite a range of things we can do, and I think that range is growing. So one is a topic that many people are putting a lot of effort in to understand, and that is the nature of the chemical composition of planetary atmospheres. And I think that remains one of the preeminent options for us for finding evidence of life on other worlds. So, for example, the mix of things like oxygen and methane and nitrogen compounds and carbon dioxide and water in our own atmosphere is a consequence of the biosphere. That particular balance and the flux, the ever-changing sort of nature of that, right? Oxygen comes and goes from the atmosphere, carbon dioxide comes and goes from the atmosphere. Those are things that we think we can discriminate between that happening because of life and because of non-biological processes. And it's something that with space telescopes, in particular, JWST and future telescopes, we think we have a shot at detecting those compounds in the atmospheres of rocky planets that might resemble the Earth. We think that's perhaps our best shot right now at doing this. There are other things that may come down the line to do with determining the color of planets, the spectra of planets, the detailed sort of pigmentation, if you will, of planets. And that pigmentation is correlated with life, correlated with photosynthetic life and other types of life on the planetary surface. So I think right now those are two promising areas. The challenge is building the technology that lets us see those things, because these are seen across light years. It's really, really difficult to do this, but we're getting there. We're getting there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, our telescopes, our microscopes, so the scientific tools we're developing are letting us peer further and further away to structures that are humongous to down to structures that are extremely small, exploring scales of space and time, indeed. One of our production assistants asked a question. So Anurup jumped in the chat because he's curious. Since you mentioned earlier that pyramids are an example of a data ohm, we mentioned other things that are part of our data ohm and information. He's curious what you think of like anthills and corals. I'll even add in termite mounds and other uses of biology for creating structure that we see. Where do we kind of draw that line in intelligence, adding information into the data ohm?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's one I've sort of struggled a bit with to understand and where that dividing line is. Yeah, an anthill, right? Ants or termites build these extraordinary structures, some of which are engineering feats, not just because they exist, but because they do things like regulate temperature. They seem, the termites seem to understand the nature of, ideal gas laws and what happens when a wind blows across your mound and so on. And they continue to build those structures over time. I think one would look at that as a type of data ohm, but rather a limited one compared to the nature of the human data ohm. In evolutionary biology, people talk about the extended phenotype, right? So phenotype is what you get when genes express themselves and build proteins. Extended phenotype is arguably the fact that you go and build an anthill, or I go and do something else in the world. And the interesting thing about it is there's this loop, and I think perhaps to sort of because I can't answer your question that well, I'm going to switch it to say, well, the interesting thing is there's this feedback loop, and this is something we didn't mention earlier about the data ohm. It changes our environment, right? And the anthill changes the environment for the ants, and there's this extraordinary feedback loop that it suddenly, if the environment is different, natural selection is going to be different. And so then that natural selection changes maybe how they build the ant hill in the next generation, and so on and so on. So maybe the line is somewhere in there to the extent to which evolution is altered and modified by that sort of externalized expression of information.
Excellent. Someone named Today in Space on YouTube has asked what your thoughts are on how we might approach a first contact if we have one. Cautiously.
Yeah, it's a good question, and obviously a lot of people have thought about this. I'm not an expert or super knowledgeable about what people have discussed, but these have been serious discussions about perhaps the biggest challenge is, and this is something I have thought about, is new information can be dangerous. Right? You have to be careful. Suppose the message from the aliens that we decode says, "We are coming to eat you," right? What is that going to do to us? Now, the aliens may not have meant that, or it may be a form of endearment, right? Who knows? So, in this even simpler form, just knowing that there's other life out there, especially if it's, so I think there's a distinction between microbial type life, simple life versus life that might actually talk to us. I think, the challenge of sort of revealing that there's bacteria on Mars is a much lower challenge, a much lesser challenge, and much less sort of disruptive than revealing that message that, the aliens have said they're coming to eat us. Right? So people have worried about protocols, they've worried about fairness, right? Because chances are, putting aside the sort of microbial life, but if it's, let's say, a signal from somewhere that SETI succeeds after all this time, who will have that detection? Will it be one nation? Will it be all nations? Will it be one culture? Will it be all cultures? How do we disseminate this in a way that's fair, but also doesn't create problems? So it's a great question. I don't have a particularly good answer to it. I know that for modern astrobiology, where we're talking about just detecting the existence of living systems like microbes on Mars or signatures in exoplanetary atmospheres, there has been a lot of work in the last couple of years on not a protocol exactly, but the standards of evidence that are used. right? It's very easy to say that you think you've found life, and then it's all over the media and it blows out of proportion. And there are a lot of subtleties to those statements. And so, as a scientific community, there is work going on to try to do a better job of saying what is robust, what you can draw from this evidence, what the next steps are, and so on, and try to do it in a nuanced way, so that people understand the science more.
Wonderful. So our next question, I kind of want to change gears with a little bit. So Hendrik Holst has asked, what kind of chlorophyll or pigments, I think he meant, would evolve to utilize infrared light or UV light from different kinds of stars that they can orbit around? Mentioned this idea of like photon harvesting, and where we get energy around certain stars. But for answering that, I kind of want to push back then to your article you published just recently, where you mentioned this concept of computational zones and where the energy might be kind of available for computation. So I wonder, in kind of answering this question of what kind of pigments might develop to use different wavelengths of energy that are available around certain stars, if you can also speak to this idea that you mentioned in your Scientific American article of a computational zone and what that means.
Yeah. Okay. So there are kind of two things in there. So the pigment question is a really good question, and people have studied this and thought about this. And we've also learned that here on Earth, there are organisms that use a variety of pigmentations or pigment molecules to absorb light. And there is evidence that some type of photosynthesis can occur using infrared photons. There's evidence of, and when I say photosynthesis in this context, I really mean, the utilization of energy to propel chemistry inside organisms. There's some evidence that can happen around hydrothermal vent systems in the deep oceans. The hydrothermal vent systems are hot, so there are infrared photons being emitted. And people have also studied what might happen around a different type of star. And some of that work suggests that the better pigments are going to make everything look black. So plants, if you have plant life, photosynthetic plant life growing around a low mass, so-called M dwarf star, which is very red in its spectrum, you may have much, much darker pigmentation to optimize the capture of photons. And then, this idea of, again, generalizing all of these processes by which life gathers energy and then does stuff with it. So this idea of computation or computational zones that I've played with my colleagues is really trying to say, well, there are many things you have to pull together to understand what give, the conditions that make life possible. There's temperature because of chemistry, and it also applies to presence of liquid water for our type of biology. But there's also has to be a supply of energy. There also has to be a supply of bits and pieces, Lego blocks, the substrate out of which life is built. And traditionally, it's quite hard to pull those different threads together. We have people who are experts in metabolism, which is the gathering and utilization of energy. But we have, the exoplanet people who are experts in planetary climate and whether or not you can have liquid water on the surface. It's hard to pull those threads together, but thinking about life in terms of the core computational processes may give us a way to do this, because those core computational processes require a certain amount of free energy. And this goes back to that idea of the Landau limit that we talked about before, that there's always a certain amount of energy required to perform computation. And that energy limit turns out to be related to temperature, environmental temperature. So we can begin to blend together the existence of energy to drive biology with the temperature of the environment, which is a major measure of the nature of an environment. And then we can look at the flow of substrates, of elements that are used to build life. So the computational zone tries to, recast things. And one thing it says is we shouldn't be so prejudiced about wanting life to exist exactly in the conditions that we find on the Earth. Free energy, for example, you can use for computation. You may be able to use energy in every different waveband, from X-ray down to, infrared photons, even into radio waves. There's no reason not to. So one of the things we're exploring with that idea, because it kind of releases you from some constraints, is, is it better for computation to use infrared photons? Is it we're not saying how you do the computation, but just in general universal terms, or is it better to do it the way that it happens here on Earth?
I love that so much. So much to explore and so many fun conceptual ideas. We have so many more incredible questions coming in from our audience, but unfortunately not enough time to ask them all. So for those asking questions in the chat right now, please take your questions online for myself, for Dr. Scharf. You can ask them elsewhere. There's one question that came in that I think we can finish with here from Sibsonker Palette, who asked for your perspective on how we might communicate with aliens, given that we can't, or we kind of have a loose level of communication with other forms of life here on Earth. We've barely really begun understanding what intelligence is, whether or not other organisms have a similar intelligence, let alone consciousness, which is way out there. And so I think Sibsonker kind of wants to know what your vision is of how we might even approach communication with intelligent alien life.
It's a great and very challenging question. So again, it's not an area of my particular expertise, but I guess I think one of the challenges I find in thinking about that question is we're so predisposed to the things we've seen in popular culture, right? Every movie, we have to talk to the aliens, even a beautiful movie like Arrival, where it's all in diagrams and, and pictograms and so on. We may have to actually start with just the rudiments of the nature of reality, cause and effect. If I do this, this happens. So let's see you do that and make that happen. And then we build from there. The rudiments of logic, in other words, may be the best place to start. It may be the way to avoid misunderstanding. That's my 2 cents.
Love it. Yeah. Finding some way to have some kind of common ground showing what we know of ourselves in the universe. I love that so much. Dr. Scharf, thank you so much for joining us for Ask an Astrobiologist today.
My pleasure. This has been a lot of fun.
Now, I will say to our audience, I highly recommend checking out the Ascent of Information. You can find this as well as Dr. Scharf's other books on his website. Just do a search in your favorite browser. You will find his website, the Wikipedia article about him, various other things that have been written by him and about him, since he's done such remarkable conceptual work throughout astrobiology. So thank you to our audience for tuning in. Remember, if you want to learn more about Ask an Astrobiologist or receive other updates about workshops and seminars and the comings and goings of everything from the NASA Astrobiology program, you can always sign up for the NASA Astrobiology newsletter. You'll always receive updates on our show times and things like that, our guests, and far more. And so, Dr. Scharf, thank you so much. To our audience, thank you so much. For everyone, thanks for joining. And until next time, remember to stay curious.